This is B7 in a nutshell. This video is suitable for double science students or triple science students, but they will need to also view the triple science content booster pack. So first of all, we started talking about communities and we looked at some key words which we'll cover now. Interdependence. This is how different species are dependent on each other for survival. So inter meaning between and dependence depending on each other. We can describe a community, which is all of the different species living in that area, as stable if the number of the individuals of each species stay roughly the same. Okay, so if those population sizes stay the same, we can describe the area as having a stable community. The more different varieties of species living in that area will enable stability to be achieved. So in other words, we're saying if it's very biodiverse, there's lots of different food sources to choose from, then we are more likely to have a stable community. The original source of all energy is the sun. At the beginning of our food chains, we see producers, which are plants, and they absorb light for photosynthesis, and they get that energy from the sun, and that energy just moves through the food chain from individual to individual. A population is the number of individuals of the same species, so we say the human population, whereas the community is all of the different things living in that area. Okay, so we tend to talk about us living in our community, but really by community we mean all of the pets, all of the birds, all of the animals that live in that area as well. So population, just the one species, for example the human population. Community, everything that lives in that area. Now, some nice easy marks here. Animals compete for food, water, mates and territory, which we can call space, and plants compete for light, space, water and nutrients from the ground. We've got some keywords here at the bottom. Producer, that's the plant. Primary consumer, the first consumer, they eat the producer. Secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, and then tertiary consumer, the third to consume. Predators hunt for food. Okay, so if something is a herbivore, it just eats plants. We can't describe that as a predator. Okay, predator hunts other animals. Prey gets eaten by other animals. The top predator can be referred to as the apex predator. Herbivore just eats plants. Carnivore just eats meat. And omnivore eats meat and plants. Then we covered some abiotic factors, okay? These are the non-living factors. It's likely that you're going to have to remember they are non-living. Think of it as biotic, biological factors are the living factors, and these are the abiotic factors, the non-living factors. And we just remember these as a list, okay? So it may just simply say, list 2 abiotic factors that could affect a community. Light intensity, temperature, moisture levels, pH and mineral content. So depending on the pH of the soil, it will affect the kind of minerals that are in that soil. So if you know a particular crop needs a particular mineral, you can encourage that by changing the pH of the soil. Wind intensity and direction. Carbon dioxide levels for plants, be careful with this one. That's really only useful when the plant is in a greenhouse and the carbon dioxide levels can be altered. And oxygen levels for aquatic animals. We know that fish take oxygen through the gills from the water, so that's important for those. Then we come on to the biotic factors. These are the living factors. In there we have availability of food, because the food is a living organism. New predators arriving to the area, new pathogens, which we would put under the category of disease, and then one species outcompeting another. And when it's outcompeting, it's at a point where they can no longer survive, they can no longer breed at a sufficient rate in order to keep their population. Then we looked at some adaptations, and we looked at the 2 extremes, the Arctic animal and the desert animal. Here are the examples here. So in a cold conditions, insulation in the form of fur, in the form of blubber, having a small surface area to volume ratio. We see the small ears, we see the very small tail. Okay, these enable the surface area to be smaller compared to the volume. And what this does is it stops heat loss to the environment. If that polar bear had big ears, like the desert fox, all of those blood vessels going through the ears would be releasing heat energy to the atmosphere. So the small ears reduce the surface area compared to the volume. So we describe it as having a small surface area to volume ratio, and that helps to maintain body temperature. Also the ability to shiver, which is the movement of the muscles near the surface of the skin, releasing some energy as heat that then enables the animal to get kind of like this blanket of warm energy around it. The desert animal has the ability to sweat. They will stay in burrows which are cool in the day, and they will probably be nocturnal, so they will be active at night time rather than in the heat of the day. They don't have much fat, so the camel has its fat stored on the hump rather than all over the body, so it's not actually acting as an insulating layer. You can see this large surface area, the ears, the legs, the tail. All of these are contributing to that large surface area to volume ratio. Large surface area means lots and lots of blood capillaries go close to the surface of the skin. When the blood flows through those capillaries, heat is lost to the atmosphere, therefore keeping the animal cool. The surface area to volume ratio concept is a popular one with the examiner. Now, we looked at factors that affect extinction in the B6 topic, so I'll go through this quickly. This could be a 6 marker. What factors cause a population to decline? Disease, that's our pathogen. Loss of habitat, loss of food, a new predator coming into the area, which we could also include into that hunting. Climate change or natural disasters such as earthquake. What could the population do to survive? Well, they could separate their communities, so even if some don't make it, the others will still be there to repopulate. They could find a new territory, which links in with migrating. Migrating, though, could be just a seasonal migration. They could change their food source, and they could adapt. Then we come across this word called extremophile, and it does exactly what it says. It's animals or plants that can live in extreme conditions. And it will be a quick 1 mark answer where probably they say, what do we refer to organisms as if they live in extreme conditions, or if they live in maybe high pressure or high temperature or extreme salt concentration? And the answer is extremophiles. Let's look at some plant adaptations. So the picture at the top there is marram grass. That's found on sand dunes. And what we can see there is that the upper surface of the leaf is actually on the outside here. That's got the waxy cuticle to stop water loss. Now it's really dry and exposed and windy on sand dunes by beaches. So what it's done is it's rolled up on itself. So within this central section, that's actually the base of the leaf. So that's where we're going to find all of our guard cells or the stomata. So if it's closed in like that, it's going to reduce the water loss from those stomata, therefore helping it to survive. We've got the cactus as well with the spines that are actually the leaves. To help reduce them being eaten. They are referred to as succulents. They store lots and lots of water inside the cactus, and you don't really see cactus or cacti but very close to each other. Okay, they've got a very wide root system so that when it does rain, they collect lots and lots of water. They've got a very deep root system as well, so they can get water from deep under the ground. This does not mean that they are not going to give you some other kind of plant to talk about in the exam. These are just a couple of examples. Seed dispersal, to ensure that plants can spread far and wide. They can be moved by the wind. The classic dandelion clock, very light, good shape to be transported in the wind. Mini explosions, some plants when they dry out, they twist and then they pop open, spreading seeds not too far but certainly spreading them over a wider area. Animals can eat seeds and then they move to a new location, and the seeds are there then in their feces that moves them to somewhere else. And coconuts are a good example of a seed that can float, so that moves it to a new location. Here we have a simple food chain. We've got the grass as the producer. It's called a producer because it makes its own food. It's producing its own food by the process of photosynthesis. The primary consumer, I've said it already, it's the first consumer to eat. The secondary consumer, in this example, it's the frog. It's the second consumer to eat. And the tertiary consumer. We could refer to the eagle here as the apex predator. It is the last thing on the list that doesn't have its own predator, therefore it's at the top. It's the apex predator, the top predator. Now, if you have a complicated food web, it may be that a secondary consumer could also be classified as a primary consumer if it directly eats the grass. Say, for example, it's an omnivore. Okay, we've covered those words: herbivore, carnivore and omnivores. Sometimes we have cyclical relationships. Okay, cyclical means it goes in a cycle, and this is called succession. So even though the numbers of the predator and the prey fluctuate, they go up and down, we can still call this a stable community because we can see those movements, those changes in numbers happens in a very predictable way. So we've said already, predators kill and eat other animals. Prey are consumers that are eaten. So here we can see prey numbers rise up here. So there's lots and lots of food. So shortly afterwards, the predators are eating all that food, so there's a bit of a delayed reaction because they need some time to reproduce and to breed. Their numbers increase as well. And then because there's lots of predators, they eat all of the food, so the prey numbers go down, and then as a result of that, because there's less food, the predators die out and their numbers go down as well. And it continues in this cyclical way that's predictable, stable community, and we call that process succession. Next we move on to the carbon cycle. Now, there are no two pictures of the carbon cycle that look the same. If you go onto Google Images, you'll see lots and lots of different versions. The example on the exam paper may be part of the carbon cycle, it may be their own version of the carbon cycle. It's likely that they will have letters or numbers on the arrows and they want you to identify what they are. So if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that the only process that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is photosynthesis. So deforestation is going to have a big impact on the carbon cycle. It's going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And really, carbon can be stored in lots and lots of different forms. Carbon can be in the form of glucose in the plants. It can be in the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It can be in the form of calcium carbonate under the ground. It can be in the form of hydrocarbons in fossil fuels. There's lots and lots of different ways that carbon can be found in compounds. And what we've got here is we've got the fact that plants, animals and our microorganisms that cause decay are all respiring. So that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Combustion also releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And it's these processes that kind of change that movement, and that's what we need to discuss. That popular question, how does the carbon of a dead leaf become the carbon in a new leaf? Okay, now how would that work then? So we'd have the dead leaf falls to the ground. The bacteria decay or decompose that dead leaf, and they are respiring because they're living things, so they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The plant then takes that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and uses it in the process of photosynthesis, creating glucose. Some of that glucose is used to make amino acids. Put amino acids together and we get proteins, and proteins are used to build new leaves, okay, for growth of the leaves. So that's how we've gone through the cycle to talk about a dead leaf becoming a new leaf. Let's go back over here again. And we're now looking at the water cycle, okay? Not too much to learn here. We've got the evaporation of water from the sea, lakes and rivers. In the clouds, that water condenses, and then eventually rain, which we call precipitation, will occur. When this occurs over the land, it's really good because it provides fresh water for animals to drink and to water the land, and then that runs off the land and we get collection of water that then is evaporated again. New content, we haven't seen any questions on the water cycle yet. So I've mentioned the word biodiversity already. It's the variety of all the different species of organisms on Earth. So if an area is very biologically diverse, then it's more likely to have a stable ecosystem. Meaning, if there's a lot of variety of foods for different organisms to choose to eat. So if one of them is removed because of disease or because there's a new predator to the area, there's still lots of options to choose from. Okay, now biodiversity isn't always just about providing food. Sometimes it's about providing shelter, and we see when we talk about deforestation that it's the removal of the trees that isn't just taking the food away, but actually it's taking a safe shelter space away as well. And we know that lots of human activities are affecting biodiversity. Okay, and it's all about now what can we do to improve that, to bring back biodiversity. Okay, waste management, water pollution. If sewage goes into the water, into a river or a lake, that sewage is full of bacteria, and the bacteria will feed on the sewage, and because they are respiring aerobically, they use up all the oxygen, so then the fish don't have any oxygen, causing the fish to die. Fertilizers. We talk about field margins in a moment, and fertilizers can be sprayed onto crops to help the plants grow. And if that fertilizer gets into rivers, then the plants in the river will grow out of control and there won't be any space for anything else to live there. Toxic chemicals. Again, we've got this word bio in front of the word. Bioaccumulation of chemicals through a food chain. So say for example a small amount of a chemical goes into a river and people think that's not a big deal because it's in such a small amount. Because the organisms in the food chain eat so much, it actually accumulates, it builds up through the food chain. So if that ends up going into something that we might eat, or it goes into a bird like a heron, then it can cause harm to that individual. Okay, so there have been cases where humans have been affected by the buildup of toxic chemicals through food chains like this. Could even cause birds to die or large fish to die. And the right hand side here is a little bit more straightforward. Reduction of land for animals and plants because of building. So we've got this growing population that needs more places to live. We've got quarrying, which is blowing up rock landscapes, which makes them look ugly, but the rocks are then used as building materials. We've got growing sugarcane. So here we talked about how farmers realised that rather than growing crops, they can grow sugarcane, and the fermentation of that sugarcane using yeast can make ethanol, and ethanol can be used as a biofuel. You're going to get a lot more money from the biofuel than if you were just growing some rice, for example. So a lot of farmers are choosing to change their crops from food crops to growing sugarcane so that they can get some ethanol and use that as an alternative fuel. And dumping waste. With this growing population, there's more waste. Okay, we need to do more recycling. Destruction of peat bogs, a very small section on the course content. Basically, there are boggy areas which are very full of water, and when trees and plants die, they fall into these boggy areas and they produce something called peat. And peat is very similar to compost, and it can be used in the same way that compost can to improve the soil quality for plants. So it's very high in nutrients and it's very high in carbon. And because people would like to use this land for buildings, because we're running out of space, they burn the peat, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's contributing to that increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, links back to what we just talked about with the carbon cycle. And carbon dioxide, along with methane, is a greenhouse gas, trapping that heat in the atmosphere, causing those temperatures to rise just like in a greenhouse, which then leads to global warming. Deforestation. Okay, this occurs because people are cutting down the trees to grow things like the sugar cane to make the bioethanol, talked about that already, but also palm oil. And we looked at the Iceland advert, and we talked about the fact that palm oil is in so many products and they are literally destroying the rainforest. So things like the orangutans and the sun bears are losing their home, and they're growing these palm trees to get the oil to use for a cheap oil for different products. Shampoo, crisps, lots of different things find palm oil in them. Okay, again, the deforestation is causing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to increase, because we said the only way to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere was photosynthesis. So if you reduce the trees, you're not pulling that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere anymore. And I said before, but I'll say it again, the ethanol, the biofuel that's produced from the anaerobic fermentation of glucose using yeast, is called bioethanol, and that's a big business that people are making money from. So, advantages and disadvantages of using biofuels instead of fossil fuels. This goes back to our evaluate question. If you see the word evaluate in a question, you must talk about the pros and cons of the method. Okay, so this is advantages and disadvantages of biofuels instead of fossil fuels. So, biofuels are renewable. Okay, they can provide jobs to people in the areas. We can refer to biofuels as carbon neutral. This means that even though when we burn them, they release carbon, because they were plant photosynthesizing, they took that carbon in, so it kind of balanced each other out. That phrase carbon neutral comes up in chemistry as well. Disadvantages, you've got the setup costs, you've got irrigation, that means watering the plants. You've got to find a way to bring water to those plants. It takes away farming land as well as rainforests. Food prices can be affected because if people stop growing their original crops and they start growing biofuels and also palm oil, then they end up having to transport their food in, and that has implications in itself, because the food will be more expensive because it needs to be transported. We talk about food miles. Okay, let's have a little bit of a look at this graph. Okay, so a very carefully manipulated scale to the graph. We've got global carbon dioxide emissions on this side, and we've got global population on this side. Those scales have been meticulously planned so that we have this really close correlation. Be careful, sometimes data is manipulated and it actually doesn't have such a strong correlation. Be careful of questions like that. So, as global population has increased, the carbon dioxide emissions have increased. This makes sense. It makes sense because there's more people releasing carbon dioxide through respiration. There are more people using cars. There's more people with more homes. They're using electricity. Electricity will usually produce carbon dioxide when it's produced. Okay. And the very last slide, maintaining biodiversity. These are the things the exam board want you to know that can be done to try and improve biodiversity. Get that biological diversity back. Okay, breeding programs for endangered species. This is going to be within zoos. Protection and regeneration of rare habitats. This is where areas are designated as you cannot cut down the trees, you cannot damage this area. And regeneration, planting of new trees. reintroduction of field margins and hedgerows. So when a farmer has a field, they have an area around the outside of the field, probably between 3 and 5 metres, which is called a field margin. You can't grow anything on this area, you can't spray any chemicals on this area, no fertilisers, no herbicides. This means that when you spray chemicals on your crop and it rains, you've got the margin as a runoff zone. So your sprays don't go into the field next door or into a river. Okay, so that's really good to have those areas that protect it. Hedgerows support a whole wealth of different things. You wouldn't believe how many things live in hedgerows, so that's also really useful. Reduction of deforestation and carbon emissions. Okay, so we are trying to do as much as we can to try and change our fuels that we use and to reduce deforestation, plant more trees so that we can reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and governments are talking about this all the time. And then finally, recycling resources rather than dumping waste in landfill. Okay, if you can recycle it, reuse it, then it will have a better use than just dumping it in landfill. Hope you found that useful. Thank you.